Hi, welcome so much. Welcome to another episode of Weekly Wisdom. My name is Bridget Burns. I'm your host, and we're delighted to have you here today.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, I partner with a journalist to have a conversation with a sitting college president, chancellor, or system head to understand what it's like to lead in this really complex time. Our hope is that this gives you inspiration, some perspective, and perhaps some wisdom for the rest of the week. So that's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom.
This week, we're excited to bring you Dan Greenstein, who's Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State University System and former director of the post-secondary education program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Dan.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. Wisdom seems like a pretty high bar, but I'm going to do my best.
We have very high expectations. You're gonna bring your perspective from your former job to this new one. This is gonna be great. So we generally like to start by just getting a sense of where folks are kind of in this world. So how are you holding up right now?
Everything's great. It's every day is another journey through paradise. Seeing the spring, feeling, quietly, I hope, optimistic about the future wind down, I hope, of this pandemic and about the future of the university system. So yeah, all is good. The sun is out.
All right, good.
So maybe start by talking a little bit about your transition now several years back to the chancellorship there, and kind of what surprised you most about it. What was most different from what you expected?
Yeah, so great question. Wow. When I left the foundation, I was genuinely looking for someone who was close to me said to me, and I was looking at a range of different options, and they said, can you imagine what you'd feel like at, some age of retirement if you hadn't actually gone to see whether all that stuff you've just been sort of thinking about and helping the foundation invest in to see whether or not that worked, right? So that was actually pretty, created kind of a turning point. And so I ended up looking for, universities and systems that serve the population that I care about, low-income students of color, disproportionately, but also one that recognized that it was at some kind of pivot point, watershed moment. And of course, I found that here at the Pennsylvania State System, which was great. The kind of big shift, and it wasn't, I guess the discovery, the aha moment was to realize that the need was there. It was widely recognized. The board was all on board. I think most constituencies recognized that things really did need to change in order to preserve and protect, public higher education in the state. I think one of the interesting things, part of the transition, is you go from the Gates Foundation, you're thinking at the high end, what's on the edge of innovation and whatever, and then you realize that many organizational structures don't have basic capabilities that are necessary, not to do innovation, but to actually make innovation sort of stick in a kind of lasting way. And it wasn't really exciting stuff. I mean, it's a lot of infrastructure and policies and just enterprise management tools that weren't here, and just a lot of time putting in place the kind of operational levers that you knew you were probably going to need going forward. So I don't know if it surprised me, but it really did sort of consume a lot of attention for the first really 18 months of my time.
That's helpful to give some context of what the challenge has been. I'm curious about what you see are you experiencing right now in the state of Pennsylvania that you think the rest of the country is going to have to deal with? And could you give us a sense of that?
Yeah, sure. And I'll be clear. I don't think our challenges here are unique. I think they're particularly acute, but I don't think they're unique. So you see it's sort of the confluent streams, right? Declining state investment. Pennsylvania is 47th in the nation in terms of its expenditure per student FTE. Has driven increases in tuition fees, room and board, which has begun to erase the affordability advantage, which is a traditional hallmark of public higher education. That burden falls disproportionately on our low and middle income students who have been sort of leaving us at a more rapid rate than others, right out of our sort of, not just when I say our, I don't mean Pennsylvania, I mean, the higher education, sort of public higher education sweet spot is that population. Enrollments are challenging to get anyway in a state of Pennsylvania, which is arguably overcrowded and in the middle of the demographic decline that Nathan Graw has written about. So you see all of those things happening, here in a particularly acute way, really over the last sort of more than a decade, dozen or more years. So I think, and of course the net effect is that begins to show up in a university's, finances and the system's finances, which create a real sort of, really take a problem and turn it into something approximating a crisis. And, one of the reasons I was so interested in the state system was in the job search, the job description that the board issued. Really, basically, you squint your eyes and you read it, and the board is saying, we have a problem. We really are looking for leadership to help us solve it. And that's rare, in my experience, for boards very publicly to say, okay, this was after I think the NCHEMS report had been done, a very good report about the sort of structural challenges that the system faced, et cetera. So it was sort of out there anyway. But it took, I think, a lot of courage for the board, with the sort of support of the administration, to sort of step up in that very public way and say, okay, we need to make this shift. Those challenges that I've just sort of reeled off, they're not, unique here. And frankly, I think, I'm so glad we got started a couple years, 2.5 or more years before the pandemic, because I suspect that you'd see some kind of an acceleration of the pace.
Well, and I'm curious, it's obviously a little early to draw too many conclusions about the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Across the board. I mean, we certainly saw more discontinuation of the academic path for the populations that you were just talking about, and I assume that held in Pennsylvania as well. I'm thinking about the national data, but is it clear to you what some of the ways that the pandemic either exacerbated or accelerated the problems?
Yeah, so not yet, and because I just don't know that we know enough about what the enrollment trends are likely to be, right? I think I'll tell you what I'm watching though is use of stimulus funding. I go back to to the Great Recession and the use of the ERA money. A lot of people took that money and poured it into recurring operating. It turns out not such a good idea. Some of these transitions, and when I say these transitions, depends obviously on where you are, but the kind of transitions we're talking about, you do not want to start down this path when you are out of cash, right? They require investment, and one-time investment, and having one time when it's going to play itself out differently depending on where you are and then what the final regs are that the ed comes up with in terms of how the money can be spent. But let's say, God willing, there is some modest one-time investment. How that's going to be used and what enrollment trajectories look like, man, that's going to make all the difference. Yeah.
So I'm curious, you talked about some of the challenges that you think you see Pennsylvania experiencing that are likely foreboding for the rest of the country. Curious if you can share how you're trying to tackle them. What are you learning from the experience of trying to tackle them?
Yeah.
Give us kind of some hope, or at least signal a direction for us to move in.
Sure. Yeah, and so let me just put some concrete details around the trends themselves. So in our case, they've resulted over the last decade in a 21+% decrease in student enrollments, right? And that's sort of average across the system. It shows our 14 universities, currently about 93,000 students. There's a lot of variety there, so the system averages kind of vary a lot of variety, but 21% overall decline in enrollment, and 62% I think increase in student, per net average cost of attendance has gone up from, 2010, our nearest competitor was about $6,500 away from us. Now it's, $1,500 or whatever. So, that's really beginning to, and then of course, in a successive years of, universities run largely on strategies of hope for a good enrollment year, a good budget year, et cetera. It is not necessarily doing across the system the really hard work of adjusting to our new enrollment realities, which, really means dealing with low enrolled programs, dealing with the fact that, we just can't any longer be, staffed in a way to serve 120,000 students, which was our high water mark. We're now at 93,000. So really taking on some of those challenges. So the board, sort of watching all this coming in 2015, 2016, sort of began the system redesign. I got here in 2018, so a couple of years after. And, system redesign really has, it really speaks to the sort of fundamental transformation of the system solely in the interest of improving our student success, right? Student success is right at the center. University success, be financially sustainable and viable, really important, but of second order importance to the students, right? And the idea was to leverage the fact that we're a system, we have distributed enormous resources and scope and breadth. If you think about across the system, 93,000 students, currently 5,000 faculty, there's almost nothing we can't do if we figure out how to kind of work together. So those were the thrust of system redesign. It really has just a few sort of fundamental sort of pushes. One of them is, a couple of them have to do with growth. We have to do better by our current students. I mean, this is true across higher education. And Bridget, obviously, the University Innovation Alliance has been a tremendous leader in this arena. Just, we can get our 6-year graduation rates on average are at 60%, which is good for our sector, but we can push them higher, right? And we have to push them higher. I mean, whether you want to come at this from a workforce development point of view or an equity point of view, we have got to do better by the students that have historically been underserved across the country, including here. Who are those students? They're low-income students. They're students of color. They are rural students. Many, if not most of our institutions are in rural settings, and our rural students are often, I think, overlooked in some of these conversations. So doing better by the students we have. How about serving student groups that need our help, probably now more than ever in the aftermath of the pandemic, but who are undersupplied? And, I guess critical need here in Pennsylvania as elsewhere is adults looking to reskill and upskill, probably not doing a 4-year residential degree. They need that next bump in name your industry vertical. That will help them, or even there's still room in fully online undergraduate degree and degree completion programs where the state of Pennsylvania and many other places are undersupplied by a regional provider. Not that the non-regional providers are necessarily less good, but there's still most people who are involved in a fully online program want to enroll in something within 75 miles of their homes, kind of thing. So serving our students better, serving new student groups who need our help, obviously stabilizing the system financially. We can come back to that, but that many years of declining enrollment, declining state investment, real reticence, appropriately in my view, about putting too much of the burden on students, has shown up in ways that just challenge us financially. And then, finally put in place the infrastructure, and I use that term loosely, that enables our universities to work together. So look, there is no reason that a student in Pennsylvania state system, even at one of the smaller, low-enrolled schools, should not have access to the full breadth of academic programming anywhere in the system. Our rural schools, are often the #1 employers in their communities. They are vital to the lifeblood of the regions that they serve. Funnily enough, not just in terms of jobs, right? They create jobs. They create the full range of leaders and health professionals and teachers that these communities need, right? And it turns out that it's not enough just to have one flavor of allied, a health profession or of nursing or of business, right? They want the full breadth, and they need the full breadth. And so it doesn't make sense that a university operating in a kind of each tub on its own bottom should only be able to stand up the programs that they can afford based on their enrollments in a system where you've got 93,000 students and 5,000 faculty. So what does that infrastructure and that policy environment look like that enables us to deliver that scope of opportunity to every single corner of Pennsylvania? Those have really been the hallmarks of our system redesign and kind of the vision for its future.
Have you been surprised, again, sort of parachuting in to higher ed, at how hard it is to get institutions to share and to think, even, I suppose, I guess system can be a strength, obviously, and one of your less well-off institutions on its own probably would be in worse shape than if it were not in a system. But it historically is pretty challenging, and Bridget knows this too to some extent, although she's managed to get her members doing a lot of sharing. But have you been surprised, and do you understand do you have explanations for why it's so hard?
This is a long conversation, Bridget. It's a whole nother program. So, at some level, I think I think of this in terms of how to incentivize sharing, and recognizing the different incentive structures will work differently in different places. Our universities, the youngest of our 14 universities is something like 127 years old. The oldest is Cheney, which is 188 or 9. I probably messed that up, but I'm not too far off. So these institutions have been operating largely independently of one another for a very long time. The system is only 35 years old, and it was basically a kind of an administrative structure that created an administrative layer between, the state government, Pennsylvania Department of Education, and the universities themselves. So I think, history is important, legacy is important, and sharing is hard. We're wired to not do that. And so, even in things like procurement, or, you would have thought, let's buy pencils together and we'll save, money. That should be easy, but it's not. And it's not because you're asking, a lot of people to change their workflow. You're asking some people to change their reward structure, and you kind of have to honor that. Like sometimes people find reward in terms of the amount of dollars they control or the number of people they manage or whatever, and we can sort of think, well, that's silly. But there's a lot of human nature, and there's a lot of emotion in fact, if you're looking for a great book, there's a book called Switch, which really deals with both the head and the heart kind of aspects of change leadership and change management. And I have to say that's been very influential in, I guess, my thinking, if not my practice, probably my practice as well, is trying to really understand that emotion and then really begin to think about how to address it and how to support people in the transitions that you're hoping that they might help you to make.
Yeah, it's hard to come into this space and not see how no institution's in a vacuum, and you can't do the work in a vacuum because, the rest of higher ed, we operate and benefit from, to some degree, a perception of scarcity because it pits individuals and institutions and sectors to compete and do their best. But that sense of scarcity makes people retract, to hide the ball, to be defensive. And it's underneath it is fear. And so if you're going to try and get people to share, it is nearly impossible to get someone to give generously when they are coming from a space of scarcity and fear. So you're tackling the real stuff. These are not delicate, these are not easy issues.
And part of the genius, I think, of UIA has been that it selected a membership which basically doesn't compete with each other, right? For students. I mean, there's probably some level of competition at some level, but not directly for students, right? And
not like, say, 14 institutions in one
the
state.
State of Pennsylvania, where there's always a billboard somewhere that probably shouldn't be there, right?
Yeah. I've generally found that there are two reasons to create a collaborative or to get people to collaborate in higher ed, especially in multiple institutions. One is a shared problem, and two is a big goal that is bigger than any one of them. And beyond that, I find that there really isn't a clear path to drive collaboration. So getting folks to be willing to admit that they all have the same problem is in itself a part of that scarcity mentality too. So anyway, thanks for coming to our therapy session.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
I did want to understand, I've been seeing what's going on in the media, and I know that, it's just really hard to drive serious change. Especially when there are entrenched interests, because the incentives in higher ed you almost have the same rewards for doing small change as you do for big change. So of course we have lots of little tiny, low-hanging fruit change, but you're trying to do real big work. And I'm just curious about how your primary stakeholders in the state of Pennsylvania have been, have they been receptive to the idea that change is necessary, or that's my question.
So I think at a meta level, yes. I mean, it's so interesting because when I interviewed, and I interviewed as anyone would, every single possible stakeholder group was represented in some context. And, and again, it was a little bit, I can't remember exactly, but a little bit after the NCHEMS report was studied, which, the study had been released and, shined a pretty sharp light on some of the challenges that are being faced here. And I think people recognize that we cannot continue to be the same. And we spent quite a bit of time. I visit each of our universities every semester and have spent, every one of those visits talking very openly and very transparently about, where we are and what our options are and why it's important that we address those options, and in language that you would both, understand. I think 60% of the jobs in Pennsylvania today require someone with some post-secondary education. 47% of adults have. My guess is the credentialing productivity of Pennsylvania universities and colleges is probably shrinking, not growing. So that gap is probably growing, not shrinking. And this we're talking about keeping the lights on in the economy. We're not talking like be number 1 or 2 or 3, right? And so You can come at this from an equity lens. I typically start there anyway, and you're just seeing as here as elsewhere the kind of, we have those sort of draws, those sort of shark draw diagrams in Robert Putnam's Our Kids, where virtually by every measure, inequality in this country is growing by race, ethnicity, and income, and higher education is probably the last best vehicle to begin to attack that. So, and then if you think of those two things together, well, you can't actually close that 47 to 60% gap unless you do better by low-income students, students of color, underserved students generally. So, the rationale, I think, is commonly held. I think everyone would prefer a much different solution. Sure, the state should come in and support higher education in a massive way. Wouldn't have to do anything. We could maintain 14 universities, and it wouldn't really matter what their enrollments. You could have fairly substantial program breadth, because it wouldn't matter if the cost of program breadth at one university was way higher than the cost of program breadth at another, because the state was, and at 47th in the nation, there's a lot of room for maneuver. We get $477 million a year from roughly state appropriations. If we were average, the national average, if we were to track with that, it would be 880 something. So there's a lot of room for maneuver within that. In the meantime, our job, and I talk about this pretty openly, higher education is a partnership. State has a job, which is to fund us and support us well. Our job is to make sure we're operating as great stewards of not just state resources. State picks up 25% of our total expenditure, but increasingly students' resources. They pick up 75%, to make sure that we're, so there are different views of the way we should go about the change. And look, some of the stuff we're doing is super hard. We're no longer a university 120,000 students big. So we're going to have to sort of curtail our expenditure. Our biggest expenditure, as in all universities, is on people. Our most valuable and precious asset, our people. And yet we're just not big enough to sustain all. So that's not fun, and it's not something anybody wants to do. You probably have seen this in the news. We're looking at integrating two groups of three of our universities. Well, from a student lens, it makes a lot of sense. It goes back to the earlier conversation we had just a moment ago about, you get universities which are just declining in enrollment. Their students and their communities still need a full breadth of academic programming that they cannot support based on their enrollments. So by integrating universities, you provide expanded student opportunity in all the full range of majors, minors, degrees, et cetera, that they require and that their communities require. But that they can't fully support on their own. But integration isn't something that people wake up in the morning and think, "Yay, hey, let's go do it. Cool." I think there's tremendous opportunities, right? I believe that, and actually, we're just preparing our reports for consideration by the board, and it's really exciting stuff because, people, what could we do if we were an institution of 13,000 enrollments that we can't do today? And let's see if we can drive, a 10% improvement in our retention and student 6-year graduation rates. So there's a lot of ambition and a huge opportunity to use that kind of organizational transformation as a kind of a reset on our student outcomes. So that's all cool, but it's hard, right? And we've taken a very devolved, just stick a minute on integration. We've taken a very devolved approach to planning, basically setting up working groups across the state. They have sexy titles like leadership and governance and the academic program break. And there are 1,000 people, students, faculty, and staff, who've worked on these working groups to build these plans. And this work is really hard because in some cases, people are working in ways where they're thinking, what is my personal future? Come back to the emotional component. And yet, just as you'd expect, when you put people who are inspired by our public service mission and are so devoted to our students, they do fantastic work. So I want to honor that. But it's, it's hard. And no, not everybody is going to be joining hands and singing Kumbaya and, waltzing into the sunset as it sets over the Ohio-Pennsylvania border to the west, I think. Yeah.
So how do you get people to conceivably, well, sort of from a leadership standpoint, how do you get people to conceivably work against their own selfish interests, or at least, what's the leadership challenge here, and how do you think you're faring at it so far? And what still needs to happen to get that alignment around the concentric, the concentric circle there.
So, I think some of the things that you have to be just ruthlessly transparent. These truths are just really unpleasant. It's almost not. There's plenty of places you can go look for my public commentary on radically transparent commentary, so I won't rehearse it here, but you can't hide that stuff under the rug. I mean, we're destroying by not acting, we're just sacrificing a future. And it's the future of a state and the future of our students. Nobody wants to do that. So, and I think it's just important and not to point fingers and you're bad. It's not about that. We just can't look in the rearview mirror, look forward. So, I mean, on the one hand, so I think being, transparent about what our challenges are. But I think the other thing is just, keeping your eye on that prize and the hope and the optimism about a future. We can do this. I mean, I say we can do this. If we can't do this in Pennsylvania, and I believe we can, somebody's got to figure this out, because this is a national problem. I mean, this is a national problem bordering on being really serious, if it's not already there. So we've got to figure this out. There isn't any longer any option, right? I mean, there are options, obviously, in the elite sector, where there's always going to be a market for those institutions, and there's going to be, people who can pay the price, and they will have endowments, and all that's good. Yeah. But the sector that we serve is 25% of the student marketplace. If you combine us with community colleges, we're damn near 50 or 60, and we're serving the people of the country who are really not going to attend the elite institutions in any large number. And the future of this country depends on our figuring this out. So I think, that imbuing it with that kind of mission, I think being just, open to that sort of organic approach to planning. I mean, and it's been interesting, we've been working with, there's other models out there that we did to determine to not undertake, which were maybe more coordinated, centralized kind of planning work. We did not do that. I don't think it would be culturally correct. You're going to go in directions and end up places you never thought you were going to get to, but ultimately, I think there's going to be a better product and greater buy-in. So I think that's been important. I think being just, having and building relationships in the General Assembly and in the administration is really important. You can't do this. These are public institutions. They're political by definition. We could talk about that forever. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing. It doesn't matter. It's a thing, right? And so we have to sort of negotiate and deal with that. And that means spending a lot of time. I spend an awful lot of time virtually now, but before that physically, in the Capitol building, individually. It's a retail business, making sure that people really understand where we are, and I understand where they are. I mean, that's and on behalf of the system. So I think that has been critical component. Look, you asked how we're doing. Or how I'm doing. In some ways, it doesn't. We're on a path where we don't really have much of an option but to find a solution. So if it's not this solution, if there's another one, good. That's not the point. The point is we've got to find one. I mean, and we are running out of time. It is not like, it's so interesting. We don't have the luxury of many of the sort of transformational approaches that I'm familiar with, because, if you think about what Arizona State did, and I don't know, when President Crow took up his position there, probably in the early 2000s, or President Becker at Georgia, again, starting around the same time, they had decade journey to continue, to begin to evolve incrementally and then in an accelerated pace. I don't think you're going to find that timeline. I don't think, there are, let me put it this way, there are other universities and systems that simply don't have that ramp.
Yeah. Well,
clock speed is not strength. We're going to have to find it.
Well, I appreciate you doing this work, though. I mean, I remember seeing that position, and especially as you were leaving the foundation, you came out with a lot of energy. You'd been at this level of being able to see change from so many different angles from afar, and so I felt like you came in with kind of like the amount of reserve energy necessary. Whereas a lot of folks who would come in, that job was a very intimidating. Like, a lot of folks were like, "Yeah, I'm not." That because it seemed like it was a really challenging space, and people knew that Pennsylvania needed to tackle really hard things. So, and just mainly what I'm what I'm picking up from this is, I don't know if there was anything in your prior leadership experience that prepared you for this, but we need to better prepare future presidents and chancellors to be able to do hard change, because otherwise we're going to keep having the kinds of folks who just nibble around the edges and do just enough to get by and then transition and retire. And so I'm glad that you're in that space. And I feel like it's a challenge for all of us to think about the kinds of things that build the resilience that you're drawing upon right now.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I think which has been critical here, and I should have mentioned earlier, is building a team, right? I mean, you can't drive this from any one person or any even small group, and there's a bunch of, and now I have actually a great team, but I would take my hat off to our 14 presidents, who had patience with their new chancellor, but who were also incredibly instrumental, have been, in getting us where we need to get to by recognizing, look, one of the important things about the state system is it's basically a single organizational structure. It is one bank account, which means that, things that happen in any one university have a ripple effect everywhere else. So if a university is financially challenged or financially strong, that will have a ripple effect everywhere. And I think, recognizing that the accountabilities that run from a president to the board through the chancellor are almost insignificant, and they're important by comparison to the accountabilities between presidents, right? I have an accountability to do good, because if I don't, somebody else is on the hook for helping, that was, as the presidents began to realize that and work with me to create a team that's able to address those challenges openly, honestly, we built great teams around the integration work, around some of the redesign, we have great people. And, it's one of the things that, I picked up in my first set of visits around the universities. We have so much creativity and talent and grit. To me, like, the optimism stems from the fact that you don't really need anything from outside. It's all here. The intelligence is all here. Even the change capabilities all here. So it's trying to figure out ways to sort of convene and support. It's a very different it's a servant kind of leadership. But that team building, whether it's the presidents, and again, I just so grateful to them for their support. Each of our universities has a council of trustees, politically appointed kind of oversight group, engaging with them directly, engaging their help. Showing up and listening. Same with the faculty union, just, it's the same approach you use with the state legislatures, just being clear about where we are, but also listening to people, and then, being prepared to, take decisions ultimately that need to be taken, that probably not going to end up, running, winning the particular flavor of the month club, vote every month. But that's not what any of us sign up for these roles to get.
Well, we're glad that you're doing this work, and we appreciate you taking the time to give us a little bit of perspective about what's happening on the ground. Doug, as always, excellent co-host per usual. Thanks so much. And again, thank you so much, Chancellor Greenstein. This has been a wonderful experience for us to just be able to hear from you. And for those at home, we look forward to seeing you next week on Weekly Wisdom.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.